the members of the community should be regarded with equal dignity as the starting point.
I mean, how do you think these claims of voter fraud are related to essentially coded claims about Black and brown voters?
In a sense, voter fraud ends up being the sort of racist dog whistle for the voters that we, the establishment, don't want to have participate. The claims of voter fraud, well, first of all, they're not empirically based. Scholars like Lorraine Mennite and Rick Hazen, as well as myself, I've reviewed their research, and it becomes very clear that from a political science point of view, there is virtually no in-person voter impersonation fraud, right? And yet the claim is that it is rampant, it is dangerous, it is significant enough that it should be worried about. Those voters who it seems the proponents of election integrity are so worried about in terms of interfering with elections seems to target, poor and minority voters who tend to disagree with the people who are raising these election integrity claims. We see every now and then a Republican operative sort of saying the quiet part out loud by saying, well, we are in essence trying to target such African-American voters because they vote Democratic.
One of the things I thought was so interesting was when you analyzed how, these claims of voter fraud are also wrapped up in these claims of the unworthy voter.
The voter suppression pattern seems to be a combination of this hyper-regulation problem that gets rationalized by this meme of voter fraud that voters not worthy of voting and that unworthiness relating to their race to be signaled without explicitly saying that this is a discriminatory rule that would in and of itself violate the Voting Rights Act or the 15th Amendment. So
I thought your work on memes was really interesting, on voter fraud memes. Do you remember the first time you saw a voter fraud meme?
That is an interesting question. Well, I can say the one that sort of comes to mind immediately, the kind of repeated notion of dead people voting.
Okay.
And in fact, I can remember a picture, and I actually use it. I did a TEDx talk, and I kind of put some of these memes up to literally illustrate the arguments. And so there's a picture of a guy who's standing in a cemetery with a clipboard, and so he facing a gravestone, and you can see all the gravestones surrounding him. And in classic meme fashion, the text is something to the effect of, like, voter registration now happening in Illinois. So, one could argue that the Supreme Court itself sort of bought into the memes around the scope and the existence of voter fraud, and that it is enough to grant the state's deference to be concerned about it in order to justify voter identification law. In some ways, that illustrates the effect of the meme. Its power to program thinking in order to buy the rhetorical argument as opposed to searching considerations around the facts.
I was talking to one of my colleagues who's a social psychologist, and we were talking about coronavirus conspiracy theories. And this reminds me a little bit of that, of, people hold on to these ideas and they're sort of immune to the facts. Most of what motivates people to spread these things has nothing to do with whether it's factually accurate.
We often get taught that our worldview and our sort of circle of comfort is what we should worry about as a primary matter. And things that don't fit that often get treated as threats. And thus, this kind of disinformation, like we see, whether it be about voting and, unworthy people voting, or whether it be about the coronavirus, it's often about building a way to see the world in a way where one feels secure and one feels confident in one's identity. The coronavirus stuff also gets to that, right? There's this mysterious illness. We don't know what to do. There are best practices in, virology and epidemiology that we can practice until we have our hands around the disease. But then people want to reject that. And it seems to me the basis of those rejections are all about, well, I want my world the way I know it and want it, because that's makes me feel comfortable.
The mental model of voter fraud is that elections are dangerous and we have to protect against this threat of elections, and they're inherently fraught with peril. You also described sort of the mental model of the unworthy voter, which is that voting is something that is you have to earn, that is a right that should be available to people who are worthy in some sense, or pass whatever test the legislature decides is the proper test for worthiness. What do you think is a better mental model for thinking about voting?
I think that the better mental model is the presumption of universality, rather than thinking in terms of entry barriers that require one to prove who they are to an excruciating degree, right? That we should assume inclusion in the sense of the people who can adequately credential themselves by a broad array of credentials. So not strict ID rules, not a narrow list of credentials that need to be required, but a broader list of things that all ordinary Americans would have, that should be presumptively true, and that then it's the government's burden to do the work of showing why that person should be excluded. And in one piece, I talked about this as sort of a communitarian value, in the sense of, the members of the community should be regarded with equal dignity as the starting point.